Signore e signori, buonasera. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the British School at Rome. I'm Abigail Brundine. I'm the director here. I'm really delighted to be welcoming you tonight. A lovely big crowd in the room and an enormous crowd online joining us from all over the world, which is really wonderful, but unsurprising given tonight's speaker. So tonight's lecture is the Rushforth Lecture on medieval Rome. This lecture series takes its name from the British School at Rome's first ever director, Gordon MacNeill Rushforth. He was the son of a button maker from Paddington, I learnt in my perusal online today, but went on through the power of his intellect to become the first director of the British School at Rome at its founding in 1901. Rushforth wasn't here for very long. He stayed in Rome for only 3 years because he said the climate did not agree with him. I'd imagine in 1901, the climate was probably quite lovely. It's a bit more difficult these days. But anyway, he was here for long enough to carry out the really vital work of establishing and stabilizing the new school in Rome. So we owe him a great debt of gratitude. He was himself a scholar of wide-ranging interests, including work on medieval Rome, and in particular on an important medieval manuscript about the topography of ancient Rome by a writer known as the Magister Gregorius, a manuscript that has also been worked on in the past by another medieval scholar of note who I need to mention in relation to tonight's proceedings, and that's Professor John Osborne, Honorary Fellow of the BSR alumnus, patron, and dear friend. John is the very generous founder and sponsor of the Rushforth Lecture series, and we're very grateful to him for it. In typical fashion, John has thought carefully both about our intellectual nourishment, but also about other kinds of nourishment, and insisted in his sponsorship that this event included drinks for all after the lecture, to which you're all warmly invited upstairs in the foyer. So enough about the past. Let's turn to tonight's lecturer. We're absolutely delighted tonight to have lecturing for us Professor Caroline Goodson. Caroline is Professor of Early Medieval History at the University of Cambridge. She's a Fellow of King's College. And since 2024, she's also been here in Rome as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Humanities at the American Academy. Much more importantly, she is also a member of the Faculty of Archaeology, History and Letters of the British School at Rome, so one of our own. And it's lovely to have brought her home to the Valle Giulia tonight from our neighbours across town for this event. So her lecture this evening draws on some recent research that she's been doing into archaeological sources, material culture, and textual sources to reconstruct an environmental history of early medieval Rome and ask questions about Rome in relation to that history, what made it distinctive, what set it apart from other places in the medieval world, and what drew people to it from far and wide. So her lecture tonight is entitled Plants, Animals and Minerals in Early Medieval Rome, and please join me in welcoming Caroline.
Thank you, Abby. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you all for coming. In typical fashion, I've changed my title right at the very last minute. I'm only going to talk about one mineral, and I'll tell you what that is. An Arabic geography written by Ahmed ibn Rusta in the early 10th century provides a now well-known account of the voyage of a freed captive, Harun ibn Yahya, from Constantinople to Thessaloniki to Venice to Rome and then beyond. At Rome, the traveler reports on the river, the city's statues and churches, the Pope, many other things. And he describes that in the middle of the city is the great church, 2 farsakhs long, with 360 doors. In the middle of the church, there's a tower standing 10 cubits in the air, crowned with a dome of lead. Atop the cupola is a bronze simulacrum of a starling. At the time of the olive harvest, the wind passing through the simulacrum of the starling makes it cry. This convokes all the starlings of the city, each with an olive in his beak, and they throw the olives on the tower. The olives are collected and pressed, and enough oil is made for the lights of the church until the same season of the next year. Now, this is a highly literary account. It intertwines Constantinople and Rome. It explains Christian habits to Muslim readers. It does a whole lot of things. We can talk about what church this might be later, but I want to stress that this is not an accurate portrayal of anything that happened in Rome, actually. I'm starting with this anecdote, as the starlings have now returned to Rome for winter, as you will have seen if you're here. They do that every year. They gobble ripe olives, as they do every year, and they poop all over the city, which is the other thing that all Romans know about the starlings. This little story is a useful reminder of the fact that medieval Rome was filled not only with the Pope, his court, lots of churches and pilgrims, but also animals and plants. People coming to Rome noticed them as distinctive. Indeed, Rome had a unique ecology, owing to its geography and to its history. The transformations from antiquity to the Middle Ages reshaped every aspect of Rome and its inhabitants, including its plants and animals. The uses to which people put the natural world, the uses to which people put the natural world changed alongside religious beliefs and structures of power. A plant's eye or an animal's eye, or if you'll bear with me, a mineral's eye of the city of Rome in the early Middle Ages lets us recognize the intertwined, the profoundly interlaced dynamics of economic, social, political, and cultural histories. Changes in religious cult meant changes in the ways in which substances, animal, vegetable, or mineral might work in the world to predict the future or to appease a deity. Changes in politics brought about changes in the economics of food gardens. Historians, and I include myself in this description, are often really focused on one lens of analysis, and so much that we tend to overlook the lateral consequences of change. None of you will be surprised to learn that there were plants, animals, and minerals in Rome. There were. And I'm not going to try and convince you that medieval churches were lit by the labor of starlings, but I'm going to show this evening that the particular array of natural resources at Rome was distinctive, and which were deliberately cultivated as distinctive. I'm going to start with animals. They are in some ways the easiest, as we have a considerable body of evidence about what animals were here, how this changed over time. And then I'll look at plants cultivated at Rome, what was here and what was not, mostly food plants, but we'll look at some others. And then I'm going to turn briefly to one mineral, natron, and its role in the glass made and used at Rome. I will range pretty widely in chronology from about 500, with a few looks backward to see earlier periods, and then down into the 11th century. I'm trying to draw a big picture across time, when things change, what things change when. And that's an important, figuring out what things change when is an important part of building up this picture of an interrelated processes. That is, I aim to focus less on the events of men, but more on the patterns observable in what men and women did with plants and animals and how this changed. It is a truism that our knowledge of this aspect of Rome, or these kinds of things about Rome, comes primarily from physical remains of plants and animals in the archaeological record, which comes through rubbish. Our knowledge, several deposits from around the Colosseum give us a little glimpse into this. The drains of the Flavian amphitheater were blocked up in two pretty distinct phases. First, the 2nd to the 3rd centuries, and then another from the 3rd to the 5th centuries. The blockages of certain drains include waterlogged organic matter, which was waste of food, which may have been eaten at the amphitheater or right nearby. So nuts, fruit, joints of meat. I've listed them as species from the drains here. Other drains, or the same drains, also included objects that were used in the amphitheater, so dice, hairpins, cups, and glasses. The food materials are very common: pine nut, walnut, hazelnut, cherry, olive, fig, grape, melon, and seasonings as well. The animal bones are principal domestic food animals: cattle, sheep, and goats. Sheep and goats are not always distinguishable in the archaeological record, unless you're somebody like Angela. So we often sort of clump them together in terms of data, and pigs. These are the main meat dishes of late antique Rome. There should be no surprises. There are no surprises here. These are very commonplace from antiquity, and they endure down into the early Middle Ages. Nearby at the Meta-Sudans, a ditch running along the valley of the Colosseum filled up in the 5th and 6th centuries with bones of more exotic animals, with no signs of butchery. These are probably the carcasses of animals that were used in the late spectacle games in the amphitheater. A bear, leopard, ostrich, red deer, wild boar, fox. There was another sort of separate dump of domestic animals and kitchen waste. Kitchen waste of, okay, pigs, chickens, and cattle, but also domestic animals, cats, dogs, one bone each of a number of urban birds. These are the kind of things, if my cat kills a mouse, I usually do put it just in the garbage and get the garbage men to take it away. And that's the kind of deposit that this is here. Now, the exotic animals were a big deal in Rome. Getting them required effort, and putting them on display showed the breadth and the extent of Rome's territories. When Quintus Aurelius Symmachus planned the Praetorian Games for his son's appointment in 401, he drew upon his network of friends from across the empire to provide animals, horses from Spain for the races, bears from Dalmatia, antelopes, gazelles, crocodiles, leopards for the hunt, plus actors and stage sets from Sicily. One of his letters complains that 50 crocodiles died en route because they refused to eat. Now, over the 5th century, imperial ceremony reoriented Constantinople. Getting wild beasts became harder and harder as former hunting grounds fell to Vandals and Goths, etc. Spectacle games were performed less and less at Rome. We have a letter written by Cassiodorus for Theodoric, which authorized a venatio, hunting game, for the consulship of Maximus in 523, and that's the last that's recorded at the amphitheater. The letter grants the spectacle, but expounds on the immorality of the events, their associations with ancient idols, the horror of taking pleasure in watching affairs that human nature ought to avoid. There had been rising concern about the morality of enjoying violent spectacle games, especially among Christian authors from Tertullian around the year 200 onwards. And so I think we can put two and two together. The challenges of procurement plus the changing tastes in spectacles meant for the end of animal hunting games. And these kinds of deposits of exotics are no longer found in Rome after these. Rome's preference for pig on the table is very, very clear from antiquity onwards. Sites in the Italian countryside saw consumption that was proportionally more based on sheep and goat, but in the city, it was pork. In antiquity, images of pigs and their descriptions in texts make clear that two different breeds of pigs were raised. One was taller, fatter, smooth-skinned, curly tail, raised in sties, and sometimes fed from milling waste or other kinds of fodder. This was with particular attention in order to make them more suitable for sacrifice. The other breed was smaller with bristly coats. In late antiquity, the pork consumed at Rome came from the shorter bristled pigs with long snouts, who foraged for acorns in woodlands, not generally the fatter ones that were kept in sties or fed from domestic scraps. The acorn-eating bristly pigs were clearly raised outside of the city. Puglia and Abruzzo supplied herds of pig and later preserved pork to Rome in considerable quantities in the 5th century, both as part of the annona and the wider market. We can get another snapshot of the food consumed, the food animals consumed at Rome from the Cryptobalbi, this time of the 7th to the 8th centuries. Now, I'm showing you a section here of the exedra of the Cryptobalbi, which became an enormous dump in the early Middle Ages with all kinds of rubbish from the 7th to the 8th centuries, delightfully filled with all kinds of rubbish. It's been an absolute mine, gold mine for archaeologists who are interested in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. We'll have a chance to talk about some of the other rubbish that's coming there, but the animal bones are particularly informative because they were sieved in context. So we get really quite a good range of bones of what people were eating and throwing away. And going back to this previous slide, the excavated domestic pig bones from the Cryptobalbi, from the Quirinale, which gives us a sort of marker of the 1st century, and the Cryptobalbi phases of the 9th and the 10th centuries, tell us a lot about the change in median size of the animals as they were butchered as adults, right? So if we look at these dots, this is standing in as a 1st century Roman example. This is the 9th and the 10th century median, and this is the 7th to the 8th century median coming from the Cryptobalbi data. So The animals grew bigger in the early Middle Ages, 7th and 8th, and then got smaller again, presumably as there's more breeding going on in the 10th century, but never quite back to their Roman size. Now, the archaeologists who were responsible for this study of the material at the crypto bulbi hypothesized that what was going on in the 7th and the 8th centuries is that the domestic pigs were crossbreeding or breeding with wild boar that were running around the Porticus Minutia in the 7th century. And I think that that's wrong. I think that's a wrong way to think about the way the domestic or the way the urban space of Rome worked in that period. And yes, I have seen the pictures of the cinghiale that are in Rome, but the 21st century is really quite different from the 7th and the 8th centuries. What I think is going on here in terms of increasing the median size has to do with butchering animals that have been foraging on the outskirts of Rome, where they could indeed have been breeding with wild boar, not in the center of the city, but on the sides of the city. But it also, I think, has to do with a relatively smaller breeding pool that is skewed towards a certain stature of animal. Now, one of the things that's very noticeable is that sheep becomes more popular over the course of the Middle Ages in terms of what people are eating. So here I'm showing you, these are percentages of bones collected, and you can just see how, well, chicken comes into the picture, we'll talk about that in a second, but also how pig becomes much less proportionally to the sheep and goat bones that are found in deposits in Rome. This is also quite different from other cities. So I'm showing you here Verona from 2 different phases, and here Brescia, where you can see pig is sort of on equal standing with cattle, that is with beef and with sheep and goat. And this is also, we could also look at Naples here. We could look at comparison data from other urban contexts. One of the things that's going on here is that sheep becomes increasingly important in the 11th and the 12th century because of its wool rather than for its meat. We can tell about the age at which an animal is butchered by the eruption of teeth and the wear on the teeth. And that tells us something about the principal focus of animal breeding, whether it's for meat or milk or traction or food. And the sheep that are coming in are being butchered after they've already delivered lots of wool. It's also, I think, interesting that chicken increases over the Middle Ages. It becomes really something significant by the time we get to the 12th century, whereas it doesn't really factor in these other cities very much at all. It's noticeable, I think, also that the size of chickens increases just like the size of pigs increases. The 7th and 8th centuries at the crypto bulbi have chickens that are much larger in stature than of a later period. I don't think that pigs are breeding with wild boar. I don't think that chickens are breeding with jungle fowl in order to make them larger. I think we need to find a better way, and proper zooarchaeologists, of whom there are some in the room, can tell us about ways we can understand this shift in stature. But it is noticeable about the population, the animal populations of Rome. And I want to just give a couple of words about horses, equids. We have horses, donkeys, and mules, which increased in prevalence over the 9th and the 10th centuries onward. Some of these were clearly butchered for consumption, and that's despite the fact that we have a papal letter that says eating horse meat is a terrible, terrible thing to do. There's a very large deposit of animal bones, especially of horses, from the Forum of Caesar, that's in association with a small neighborhood located there in the 10th century. So a specialist butcher of horse meat, it looks like. But horses were, of course, also used for spectacles and for other purposes. Horses were used in the circus. We can guesstimate that on a day of races at the Circus Maximus, about 700 or 800 horses might have been needed. These were special horses. They were raised and trained for years. Spectators looked in on the horses in order to gauge their chances of their racers on a day. The stables of the horses were kept by factions on the Campus Martius, sort of near the Circus Flaminius. I don't know where they were in the Middle Ages. If someone's got any idea, I'd be delighted to hear. The last races, the last parades of charioteers through the Forum took place in the 6th century. Imperial ceremony used horses, and then papal liturgy also used horses. The image of imperial authority on horseback persevered into the Middle Ages in the form of bronzes and marble statues. We have this one, but the Curiosum Urbis Romae and the Notitia, which are lists of different kinds of things which appeared in different regions of Rome in late antiquity. They give us vast numbers of statues across Rome, now lost to us, including 22 equestrian statues. And not just statues of horses. Cassiodorus, another letter from Cassiodorus, this time in the name of Theodotus, the Ostrogothic king, wrote to the urban prefect in 535 or 536, saying that the bronze statues of elephants on the Via Sacra, on the Roman Forum, needed to be repaired. They totter near complete ruin. And what would be accustomed to live beyond 1,000 years in the flesh seemed to endure a lingering death cast in metal. Let your foresight cause the appropriate longevity to be restored to them by strengthening the rent limbs with iron fasteners and bracing the sagging bellies of the bronze statues with iron staples. I'll return to the matter of statues of animals in a moment, but I think it is really quite important to point out the way this letter stresses towards the end that there's a real value in having images at Rome of exotic animals that might not be seen elsewhere. Those who have not beheld the creature in life may recognize the fabled animal by the renditions of the statues. And then he goes on to a much longer discourse about what elephants do, how they are used in battle, were used in battle, how they don't have knees, and so if they fall, they can't get up, all kinds of stuff. Elephants do have knees. That's not true what he wrote. But the letter is an opportunity to talk about the exotic and the exciting and the things that Rome permits people to discuss and contemplate about the natural world. Popes used horses, not elephants. The Ordo, the first Ordo of the 7th century, talks about a pope riding through the city on horseback towards procession to deliver the service at Easter. And because horses were used in solemn procession of the papacy, they could also be used in parades of infamy. So we have a couple of accounts of rivals to the papal throne being sat on a horse in a saddle designed for a woman as a way of humiliating him. Or similarly, John XVI, John Philagathus, who was a rival to the papacy in 997, was blinded, his tongue was cut out, and he was put on a donkey backwards and processed through Rome. So donkeys were pack animals and traction animals, and women's saddles were obviously inferior. And the choice of these characterizations underscores the humiliation of this parade of infamy. So the broad picture of animals in medieval Rome is this. In terms of food, pork dominated the table. This was the legacy of the annona, I'm pretty sure, the ancient system by which the certain Romans were allocated foodstuffs, first grain and then bread instead, and then bread plus oil, wine, pork, all on an annual basis. The mechanism of the annona provided all kinds of opportunities for piggyback trade in the same products, and it set a profile for what was eaten. Pork gives way to other animals, especially sheep, but these animals have primary and secondary uses. But pork's dominance, I think, endures from the pattern established by the annona. Now, if we think about plant foods, Rome had always relied on its hinterlands around the city for grain, olive oil, wine, as well as fresh fruits, nuts, firewood, and vegetables. This system continues into the Middle Ages. It's really very difficult to talk about what plants people ate. Animal bones may persist in many archaeological contexts, but plant remains tend to decompose and dissolve into brown and smelly clumps, unless they've been carbonized or mineralized in certain archaeological conditions. We can look at transport containers to give a sense of what came to Rome and where. Now here I'm putting sort of quite complicated images up on the screen. I'm putting this as a marker of the 2nd century to give you a sense of the wine and the oil that was imported to Rome on the basis of its transport containers, just as a reminder of how important Roman hinterland was for both of those products, even in the sort of height of imperial commercial activity. Iberia being obviously the major other importer of olive oil in this period. And here I'm showing you another kind of metric around the different transport containers that shows here, as you can see, that peak in sort of the middle of the 2nd century here, specifically of wine transport containers. Olive oil, we have fewer of them, and they're the green ones down here. But this gives you a sense of change already taking place by the beginning of the 3rd century, and the decrease in the arrival of imported goods into Rome that dwindles down very, very considerably by the time we get to about 700. Certain products did continue to arrive in Rome. We've got wine and oil that comes from Sicily and southern Italy. Wine from Palestine seems to have been the most important import of wine in the 6th and the 7th centuries. And it is kind of interesting that Levantine amphorae were very large. And so 20% of the profile of amphorae fragments from Levantine amphorae is really quite a lot of wine compared to other imports that come from North Africa and the Aegean. There are globular amphorae, which have wine arriving at Rome from Campania, but that stops about in the middle of the 9th century. And there's very, very little evidence for Sicilian transport amphorae into Rome in the 10th and the 11th century. Although there was Sicilian amphorae arriving in Salerno, in Naples, in Pisa, and many other places on the Tyrrhenian coast. The grains, the fruits, the vegetables on the table appear to be those of antiquity. Some are wheat for bread, barley, emmer, other grains, lentils, fava beans, other pulses, a range of tree fruits, peaches, plums, cherries, wild berries, those sorts of things. In early medieval Rome, people grew food plants in their orchards and in their food gardens near their house. From the 6th century, houses in Rome had garden plots. Some houses in Rome had garden plots attached to them. This is clear from the letters of Gregory the Great, one of which I'm putting up here on the screen. Gregory the Great has 3 houses with gardens attached to them that he allocates to religious communities in Rome. So monasteries can be set up in houses with gardens attached to them for the provisioning of the community, right? So that the nuns in this case can have what they need within their property. But it's not just religious communities that have gardens attached to their houses. It's all kinds of houses. Once we get more evidence, the documentary record for Rome expands in the 9th, then in the 10th and the 11th centuries, we see more and more of these houses with attached garden plots. So in the 10th century, about a quarter of all property documents at Rome refer to a house that has a garden next to it in the city. What plants people grew is really hard to know. We've got a little bit of archaeobotany. So from the Comune excavations at the Forum of Caesar, a large household garden of the early 9th century produced seeds of cabbages, lettuces, white mustard, mint, aniseed. And then slightly later, when it was converted into an orchard in the second half of the 9th century, there were cherry, plum, fig, and hazelnut, and grapevines that probably had aromatics and other vegetables planted between them. But it's hard. It's very hard to know. One of the things that we can look at, we can look at other places that have archaeobotanical evidence. Northern Italy has quite a good history of studying archaeobotanical evidence from urban contexts. And there we can see that this period of the first millennium is one of really quite considerable change. That the moment of major introduction is, as we probably could have guessed, in the 1st century. That's when new arrivals are integrated into the cropping of Italy. And some of those fall away. So date palm ceases to be visible in the archaeological record in antiquity. Others carry on sort of intermittently all the way through. This is chestnuts. Pine nuts have their moments, and then they tend to fall away as well. Whereas peaches, which are introduced in the 1st century, carry on all the way through into the Middle Ages. At Rome, we can see some glimpses of this. We know that one of the introductions that happens in the Middle Ages is sour cherry, and we've got glimpses of sour cherry in the archaeobotanical record from Rome. When we have documents, though, we can see people paying rent in kind. So here I've made you a sort of visual of the contract between a certain woman, Stefania, and the convent of Santorini in Campomarzio in the later 11th century. And she is responsible for paying a yearly rent in cash, which is presumably an equivalent of cash, but it's given in the document as cash. But she's also required to have to provide 13 modi of onions. That's 87 kilos of onions. So it's not an insignificant amount. 3 brancas, I'm not sure what that means. And it's a unit of measure of sicis cucuzzis, which I think are cucuzza. They're a cucurbit, which is somewhere between a cucumber and a gourd, which you can still get in southern Italy. 3 fiales of mustard. Now, that could be mustard seed because it's in a bottle, or it could be mustard greens if they're somehow preserved. I'm not sure. 2 galatos, I don't know what unit of measure that is, of beans. And these are the beans, the fagioli of the early Middle Ages, before the New World introductions of cannellini and the beans that are very commonly eaten now, and 1 of coriander. And then every Saturday between the 24th of June and the 15th of August, the Feast of St. John the Baptist and the Assumption of the Virgin, 1 hamper of vegetables had to be delivered from the land, which was in the Grotta Prefetta, so out on the Via Appia, to the convent in Santorini in Campomarzio, which is about a 2-hour walk. It's not terribly far away, but it's some distance. This mechanism of rent in kind we can see it echoed over all kinds of documents from this period, and it gives us a pretty good sense of how fresh food came into this convent in this case, and into urban landlords. If we look at human remains, we can see a little bit about what people ate. We've got isotopic analysis of about 100 early medieval Romans, and here they are plotted. Here's the aggregate plot of the Romans here in black, compared to other places in Italy and other periods. And here's the plot of the early medieval samples here. You see that there's 1 outlier. And for those of us at the American Academy, it's worth pointing out that this is about 7 or 8 individuals that come from San Pancrazio. So right next to us at the American Academy, these are the outliers for whatever reason. One of the reasons that the people who did the analysis think that they look so different is that they're eating a lot of freshwater fish, whereas nobody else in Rome is eating freshwater fish in the early Middle Ages. So we can see that Romans fall in line with sort of contemporaries. They've got their own distinct profile of what they're eating. It's mostly a terrestrial diet. There's very little C4 food, which would be sorghum and millet, which people are eating in northern Italy. And there's very little saltwater fish, which people on islands and in southern Italy are eating a certain amount more of. Fascinatingly to me, given the size of Rome and the imports of all kinds of things, like papyrus and like silk, which we'll see in a few minutes, we have no evidence at Rome of the importation of preserved fruits and vegetables. Ravenna is the only place in Italy where we have rice. Asiatic rice, was written about in medical texts in Latin that were circulating in Italy, but does not seem to have been grown in Italy, and the material that comes in Ravenna is surely brought in because it comes from the wharves in contexts from the 8th to the 10th centuries. It really only becomes seriously grown in Italy, in Sicily in the early Islamic period, and then in northern Italy in the 15th century. Sorghum bicolor, which is grown in northern Italy already from the 5th century after Rome, is not found in the archaeobotanical record in Rome. It's just worth thinking about the fact that there's quite a lot of movement of crops going on in the early Middle Ages. About 50 years ago, Alan Watson made the case for a green revolution. Right, that the first Islamic empire and its expansion in the 7th century brought the expansion of religion as well as the expansion of Asian fruits and vegetables, rice, sorghum, lemon, durum wheat, a bunch of other stuff, sugarcane, banana, mango, artichoke, etc. Now, that basket of Asian fruits and vegetables has in the past 50 years shown to be really quite silly on a lot of levels. Durum wheat has been cultivated in the Roman Mediterranean forever. Artichokes appear on Diocletian's price edict, so certainly they were available in the Mediterranean before the arrival of Islam. They were clearly around. And some crops have never been relevant in the Mediterranean. Coconut, mango, that's not part of the transformation of Mediterranean cropping. But others did circulate from the Middle East to the wider Mediterranean through Iberia and through Sicily, as well as through Egypt. And so this is a map showing the sites with archaeobotanical remains that come from the Islamic Green Revolution species, so including Sicily, but none of that really comes into Italy. Rome is not a portal for the introduction of new species for cultivation in the Middle Ages. We've looked at patterns of food and work in the early Middle Ages, how the legacy of Roman tastes endured, while the patterns of commerce of the Roman period fell away, resulting in very strongly local provisioning of a mostly terrestrial diet. We've seen that pigs had been essential to Roman religion for sacrifice, and they were replaced by different figs who foraged and looked different and were eaten presumably without ritual. Plants were important to rituals as well in the Roman period. There was a collegium of dendrophoroi who bore a sacred pine each year on procession to the Magna Mater. And their tree and their basilica are named in the regionary catalogues on the Caelian Hill. The lands of the dendrophori were seized by the emperors Honorius and Theodosius in the beginning of the 5th century. But as I say, the memory of that place endured in catalogues. Ancient authors talked an awful lot about the trees in Rome. There was the Ficus ruminialis, which was associated with the Lupercal and Romulus. There was a fig in the middle of the Forum, but none of these appear in any of our texts about the early Middle Ages. The Ansidel itinerary mentions cypresses, but that's the extent of it. In antiquity, we've got quite a lot of evidence for laurel, poplar, myrtle, and flower garlands, roses and violets especially. Some of the ceremonial crowns were oak or grass from a battlefield or olive, but many of them were flowers. And these were used in religious dedications in temples, in funerary ceremonies, as well as in household shrines. Given the demand from the Orps, flowers for garlands were grown around the city for distribution in markets, right? These are sort of perishable goods that had to be grown close to the city and then brought into the city. But as the closure of temples meant the end of garlands, that whole system of production, where tomb plots outside the city were planted with violets and roses, where people daily brought in collections of fresh flowers for garlands, all of those essentially stop. The Rosalia is still celebrated in the calendar 357, but really that seems to be the absolute end of it. And early Christians did not like garlands and blossoms, or at least some of them. So Tertullian, he's the same one who poo-pooed the games earlier, also made flower garlands very unchristian in his poem about the crown of thorns. So to repay Christ, if he be not crowned with flowers at all, if you cannot be with thorns. So this sort of opposition between what the ancients did with their flowers and what we, the Christians, do is something that I think endures alongside the economic shift by which it's no longer useful to grow flowers. So attitudes towards certain plants and animals differentiated Christian Rome from that of its past and its traditions. Spectacle games ended, the memory of these sports was not lost, though, and animals play key roles in stories about pre-Christian Romans and their cruelty. There's a handful of martyr narratives that specifically identify the amphitheatrum, the Flavian amphitheater. It's known in Latin sources as the Colosseum only in the 10th century. That remember the Flavian amphitheater as the place of martyrdom, where Christians died upon imperial orders. Several early passions of Christians remember martyrdoms as damnatio ad bestias, a spectacle of capital punishment, which took place during the games. These violent spectacles apparently continued into late antiquity. This appears as a punishment in the legal compilation of Justinian. In Christian narratives, it's a trope about savage cruelty. Abdon and Senon, who were saints condemned to death, were sent into the spectacle in the amphitheater, but the lions and the bears that were released to savage them crouched at their feet to protect them. Similarly, the Passion of Chrysanthus and Daria, which was composed in the late 5th century, features a lion escaped from the amphitheater who protects Daria, who's been sent to a brothel. This is a pair of Christians who feigned a marriage but lived chastely, and this annoyed their neighbors, and they were seized and condemned. Daria is sent to a brothel, and an ugly yet famously seductive man is sent to her. An escaped lion protects her. It climbs into the room and protects her from the man, who of course converts to Christianity. And the lion is calmed by Daria, and everyone escapes happily. Now, these are Latin gesta of the 5th to 7th centuries. These are stories that are set in a semi-fictional, violent, sexualized Roman past. They report remembered elements of topography, a series of wicked administrative officials, remembered elements of ancient society and culture, or invented elements of ancient society and culture. The 6th century audience of these may not have witnessed wild animals in spectacle games, but recalled them from a not so distant past. In the Saints' Passions, animals are often used to show the saintliness of martyrs whose bodies are not touched by wild animals, flies, or vermin. And in contrast, Saint Cecilia lists the animals who make homes in cult statues to show how empty the statues are. Spiders cover them with cobwebs, birds poop on them, and there are storks that make nests on the heads of statues. These are not accurate reports of what happened in Rome or the animals that lived there, but they do reflect memories and they activate memories of the city's past. Stories of saints' passions continue to circulate in the early Middle Ages, and these paintings of Chrysanthus and Daria date from 9th century, so some 200 or 400 years after the composition of the Passion narrative. The lion is standing in for a bad old time, the cruelty of Roman spectacles, and the innocence of animals who are able to perceive the holiness of saints. Now, if you haven't had a chance to read it, please do. Robert Coates-Stevens' new book on statues is an outstanding book in many ways, but one of the things that it does is tells us about just how many statues there were in Rome. He gives a figure apparently calculated by Amanda Claridge that there might have been 500,000 statues in Rome of the 3rd century CE. Robert makes a case for how those statues declined over time by being reconfigured, melted down, broken up into pieces, burned, used in lime kilns, etc. And makes clear that exceptionally few new statues were made at Rome. Those that were often very small in scale and often of animals. So baptistries were decorated with silver deer, golden lambs, and doves. None of these are preserved to us now because the materials were reused and recycled, but they appear in the donations to the Liber Pontificalis, for example. Now, I'd like to consider against this sketch, very briefly, a mineral, natron. Natron is a naturally occurring mineral, an evaporitic compound of sodium carbonate decahydrate. In the Roman period, the sources of natron in the Nile Delta, especially Wadi Natrun, and the sources of sand in the Levant were exploited intensively for the making of raw glass in quite specific centers in Egypt and here in what's now Israel. The raw glass that was made sometimes in very, very large furnaces like this at Jalame were then cracked into bits. The cullet was shipped to workshops to be made into panes, blown, hand mold-made glasses, vessels, sheets for tesserae, for glass gems, for window panes, etc. The 2nd and 3rd centuries CE witnessed a real increase in glass production and use across the Roman Empire, the vast majority of which came from Egypt and Palestine. At Rome, the minerals, the raw materials, natron glass never existed. Glass arrived as cullet to be worked here. Natron glass was the base recipe for all of this glass and more: window panes, drinking vessels, wall mosaics, etc., etc., etc. Late antiquity is in some ways the golden age of vessel and window glass. It typified a certain production system that was characteristic of late imperial economy, drawing upon resources at one end of the empire, making it at scale, and then circulating it to secondary workshops and distribution centers elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Again, it allowed for rejigging for a local market. Glass lamps were increasingly attractive as lighting implements in late antiquity, and an important part of domestic and church furnishings, really from the 4th century onwards. Terracotta, of course, was still used as a lamp material. Metal oil lamps were certainly still used, but large-scale glass lamps or large-scale metal structures to hold these little glasses in which oil was put in became increasingly common from the 7th century onwards. At Rome, new glass made in the Eastern Mediterranean continued to arrive through the 6th and 7th centuries, and glass working took place at the Crypta Balbi in the 7th and the early 8th centuries, as we know from that huge deposit. Glass products from this period show signs of increased recycling, a higher proportion of certain trace elements introduced through mixing and contamination in the crucible, and point to extensive recycling of natron glass all the way down into the 11th century here in Rome. That's interesting to me because elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, people also struggled with the problem of not having sources of natron or access to natron glass by developing new recipes. In the end of the 8th or the early 9th century, natron was essentially abandoned as a principal fluxing agent, and the large-scale workshops of raw glass in what's now Israel were closed or converted, as the one at Bet Sharim, to plant ash glass. So this is all high soda plant ash that's made from the ashes of forest or marine plants. People in Iberia in the 9th century started experimenting with plant ash glass, and people in all over the Islamic world are doing it as well. These products circulated, but they do not appear to have arrived at Rome. We've got some in Venice, we've got some in Bari in the 10th and the 11th centuries, but we don't really have any in Rome. This could be a problem of a lack of analysis, and Francesca Colangeli has some good ideas about how we can answer this question, and she's also got a British Academy postdoc in which she can explore it. So this is hold that thought. We might learn more really soon. But one of the things that's really distinctive about medieval Rome is the quantity of glass mosaics that are here, and the new mosaics that were produced throughout the Middle Ages in churches. So I'm showing you here, just keep your eyes on Rome. These are maps from Liz James's wonderful book on medieval mosaics. And you can just see that over time, lots of mosaics made lots of places, not so many, but always made in Rome, even fewer, but certainly still made in Rome, even fewer, certainly still made in Rome. And it's only in the 10th century where we don't have evidence for new glass mosaics being made. Now, in the 70s and the 80s, art historians claimed that tesserae were cleaned for reuse. Nordhagen said that sometimes tesserae were pulled out of walls, put in a furnace to burn off the plaster, and then put back up into walls. John Osborne, who had the privilege of standing on scaffolding at Santa Prassede and looking at the Apse mosaic in 1987, saw rounded tesserae, which to him suggested that these were reused tesserae coming from Roman wall mosaics. But as mosaic restorations have taken place in recent years, tesserae have been analyzed for their chemical components, which tell us about the raw glass and the colorants that were used and whether or not they were newly made, recycling natron glasses, or taken out of Roman walls and put and replaced or reused directly in church mosaics. So here, from the Apse mosaic of Sant'Agnese fuori le Mura, dating from the reign of Honorius I, so that's 625 to 34, we've got tesserae with a glass base using recipes known for Egyptian raw glass of the imperial period, mostly blues and greens, as well as recycled glass, some of which is blue and some of which is white, and newly made glass, that is newly made from natron bases of gold, gray, red, orange, and purple, pink. Now, in this analysis, they did about 50 tesserae and they equally distribute. So about 18 or so of each of these different types. It's not one color wholly that's totally made new or reused, but a real mixed industry. Rome, of course, really had an awful lot of glass to reuse. From the Baths of Caracalla, Janet Delane estimated nearly 17,000 square meters of glass mosaics for the walls and the vaults in that building alone, and 3,400 square meters of window glass for that building in the 3rd century. All of that has disappeared for recycling. Rome not only had more mosaics than anywhere else in Constantinople in the Middle Ages, it had vastly more material available for recycling than anywhere. Of course, Roman builders used bricks, marble, metal, nearly everything they could from the remains of ancient buildings, and the spoliation of ancient architectural elements became a distinctive feature of early medieval buildings, both here at Rome and elsewhere. Some building elements are more charismatic than others. Sparkly glass pictures in glass, yes. Bricks, maybe less charismatic. But I think that the patronage of glass mosaics, the deliberate reuse of ancient glass to create a concentration of distinctive images and experiences of walking into one of those buildings and seeing the glittering mosaics, that was a deliberate effort on the part of the Romans to create an experience for people in Rome and people coming to Rome. By the papacy, of course, but also other patrons, to set Rome apart. The intensive farming of glass into church mosaics was part of an array of distinctive qualities that Rome fostered. So, at the table, there's more pork than elsewhere in Italy. That reflects a strategy of raising different kinds of animals and all kinds of ensuing details. The city was filled with images of animals, some deliberately exotic, and the stories people told about the Roman past included exotic beasts, no longer commonplace, but apparent in any case. The monuments of early medieval Rome, the churches, were filled to the brim with the kind of things that might be seen elsewhere, but never in such quantity. Silks, we've just seen a couple of them go by quickly. I'll go back to them so we can feast our eyes on them quickly. There, here's 2 from the Sancta Sanctorum, a Persian silk of a cockerel and a scene of the Nativity with its little barnyard animals here. These silks were available elsewhere in the early Middle Ages, but nowhere near at the quantity as they were here in Rome. And of course, glass mosaics. For Harun ibn Yahya, the visitor to Rome who reported about the starlings and the olives, the animals and the plants, both real and artistic, stood out in his account. The simulacrum of the starling, which whistled on the top of a church, may be some echo of some of the metal birds which stood atop some Roman churches. Here are 2, I think, delightful cockerels from Roman churches. Now, the dating of these is really quite unclear, and I am not a historian of sculpture. Some people say 9th century, some people say 12th century. They were later put on 12th century bell towers, that's for sure, but they may have stood inside the churches before. At the Lateran, there was a cockerel on a porphyry column, which stood outside. It appears in early modern descriptions, but it also, as Robert Coutts-Stevens has really recently pointed out, appears in another Arabic account of Rome by Yakut, whose encyclopedia, written around 1200, says that at the Church of Zion, which he identifies, is conventionally identified as the Lateran, there's a golden bird called As-Sudani, of Sudan, the one from Africa, or the dark one that holds an olive in its beak and an olive in each of its claws. And at its foot is a basin with olives that are brought at harvest time from the birds of the city. Now, that's clearly an echo in the Arabic tradition of Harun ibn Yahya's story. And indeed, Yakut, like Ahmed ibn Rusta, uses earlier writers in their texts. But bring me back to our starting place. The ways in which early medieval Rome was distinctive, outstanding even in the early Middle Ages, had to do with its illustrious past and the way that was marshaled into new frameworks. So let me conclude. In the 6th century, systematic changes to economy, political structure, and society produced changes to the way in which people used animals, apparent in changes to the overall proportions of the livestock they butchered, how they cultivated plants for food. This is quite distinct from the political shifts which happened, of course, a century earlier. The period of the Carolingian involvement with the papacy brought about a change in the means of production and the distribution of food resources at papal estates, not, I hasten to add, because the Carolingians were contributing it, but because there was a reorganization. And in the 10th and 11th centuries, the economy changed sufficiently to encourage market-scale agriculture, and indeed markets for fresh food at Rome. The broad picture of animals and the way they were used emerges from the excavation of rubbish. This suggests broad continuity across late antiquity and into the early Middle Ages. Tastes and the production systems which brought pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, and poultry to the table did not significantly change, except in terms of scale. It was once suggested that early medieval food regimes became much more meat-heavy as late antique norms were influenced by northern barbarian diets and a rise in hunting and foraging. That's Montanari. There's no archaeological evidence to support that for Rome in the slightest. This is an urban context, and the urban systems of food provisioning from antiquity endured. The observable changes relate to a less sophisticated system of provisioning the city, smaller range of imports of animals and plants and products, and animals raised for multiple purposes. It's notable to me that Rome did not serve as the portal for introduction of new species from the Islamic world or the Byzantine East. Indeed, the disconnection between Rome and Sicily is really quite important. The wealth of materials for craft and glass in particular served Romans well in the Middle Ages, providing the resources for a distinctive and very rich material culture, concentrated perhaps through the church, but the effects of this distinctive material culture extended to other Romans and to anyone who came to Rome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was magisterial. That was so enjoyable. It was also, I was really struck by how live the conversation feels. I mean, you said it's recent work and you were showing us sources from the last year or two coming from other perspectives. And it's really exciting to see a kind of conversation developing, and then you sort of at the center of that also spanning an awful lot and pulling it together. So that was really enjoyable. Thank you so much. We have a room full of specialists. We have some time for and non. You are all welcome. And we have also an online audience who are welcome to put questions in the Q&A box. If anyone would like to start, I do have a question, but I will hold it in reserve and open it to the room. If you do have a question, don't ask it yet. We just need to understand if we're about to all evacuate the building.
That's frightening.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we don't know if it's an accident or not, but can I suggest we all evacuate out into the front with deep apologies, especially. Okay, hold your horses.
That's a good pun, Abby. Really good.
Okay, I can confirm it is not a fire. We just didn't want anyone to get too comfortable. These things are sent to challenge us. So I had a fire alarm in the middle of my Cambridge interview. So there we go. Okay. So to return to where we were, which was in the Middle Ages, I was going to open the floor to questions, although you may all be a little over. Okay. Thank you. And please do use the mic also so that our participants at home can hear.
Caroline, thank you. I took notes furiously. I can't wait to talk to you and to visit all the bibliography that you provided. I had a light go on when you mentioned the fact that over the course of the Middle Ages, sheep become increasingly important with respect to pigs. And you mentioned the wool industry, which clearly is, definitely a consideration. I can't help but also think of parchment production because did you say it's 11th century that this is happening?
Yeah, it's context from the 11th and 12th centuries that we
11th and 12th centuries, because in that period we also have a spike in the production of very large manuscripts, or at least of the evidence for them. And I'm wondering what you think there.
Are they sheep parchment?
That's what we don't know. I actually just had a very long conversation with a young scholar at Cambridge, I believe, who is working on that question right now and doing DNA sampling, or wanting to do DNA sampling in Italy. So let's hope for evidence there soon.
Yes, so Jo Story actually at Leicester has a project on exactly this question. Although I don't know if she goes to the 11th and 12th centuries. I don't know how late she goes in terms of this. But that is a fascinating intersection, which I don't know the answer to. I think one of the things that's important to remember, I've done my best to sort of sketch a very, very big picture, but it's quite important to weigh carefully the bits of evidence that we have, and the majority of of the bones that we have from the 11th and 12th centuries come from Santa Cecilia and Trastevere excavations, and Santa Cecilia and Trastevere is a convent, right? And it actually may have been a monastery in the 12th century. I can't actually remember when it switches gender. But there's good reason to think that that's about monastic scale production. My initial assumption was that it's monastic scale of production of weaving, not of parchment, although that's something to think about. And I don't know how I'll go about answering it, but I'd like to think more on that. That's really useful, Lila. Thank you very much.
So early modernist here, so not my time period, but I wanted to pick up on the chickens that you sort of like flagged, because one of the things that I do know about ancient Rome is that they use chickens for divination and that sort of thing. So it was really striking to see them completely absent from the diet and then sort of like make a late arrival in your graph. And then as a sort of historian of the church, I was also wondering about fasting and, the idea, so you mentioned no fish, but of course, Catholics traditionally have eaten fish on Fridays. And I was wondering, I mean, this would obviously be very difficult from the archaeological record, but wondering if there are historical records to talk about, sort of like how Christian practices of fasting and abstaining from different food items are affecting your story.
Those are really good questions. Thank you. So about Roman chickens, I'm going to just point to Angela. Angela is a bona fide zooarchaeologist. She knows much more about fauna in antiquity than I do, and has written indeed about chickens and their arrival into Italy in the pre-Roman period, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So they're around here for a while, and I think Angela would probably be the first to hold up her hand and correct me and say it's not that there are no chickens. There definitely are chickens around, but what we were looking at there are percentages of the overall bones recovered. And so you've got to kind of weigh that. So thinking about that, all of those other birds that we found one bone from whom was found would never even appear in the percentages. They'd be so small. And so chickens are around, chickens are kept, eggs are certainly eaten, eggshells appear in some kinds of rubbish deposits. But my broad understanding is that yes, Romans used chickens for other things, not so much eating the meat. Some, but not huge amounts. I was just reading again the recent excavations from the Cunei in the Colosseum, which have deposits of a much later period. They have some Roman deposits and they have much later deposits. And they've actually got a good chunk of chicken wings in one of the drains of the Colosseum. So it may be that there's actually a little bit more than I don't want to give the suggestion that there's absolutely no chicken. There's some there, but it's not a significant part of the diet. Now, in terms of fasting, that is a very interesting and a very interesting question, a very vexing question. There certainly are texts about what one ought to do, right? we know what Benedict says about quadrupeds, and you're not supposed to eat them unless you're very elderly or very sick. And we know about the expectations of fasting, but it's very, very, very hard to see in the archaeological record the observance of fasting. And the medieval archaeology is filled with studies of monasteries where they find cattle bones and have to explain them somehow, right? That they're in the kitchen rubbish, but monks aren't supposed to eat these things. So how do we negotiate this? And it's certainly, there's and I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a 14th century monastery in Paris that's absolutely filled with the most gluttonous things that anybody could be eating. And it's clearly the monastic diet. So there's a big difference between what the normative texts say we ought to be doing and what the archaeological record can actually tell us about. And it's also very, very hard to know what proportion of the population is observant in terms of fasting and how much of that is actually going to appear in these big clumping studies, which is what I have been working through. Clumping as much data together as we possibly can in order to see broad pictures rather than individual sites. I will say, and I will make a reference to another one of the sort of amazing British School at Rome projects, the excavations at San Vincenzo Volturno, where the monastic kitchens were excavated with enormous detail and filled with wonderful, insightful details, like when the Arabs attacked in October in 881, it was they had just eaten figs because they had the drains were filled with a big sort of with bowls full of kitchen waste of figs. There's very little in the way of quadrupeds there. There's quite a lot of bird. There's a certain amount of fish. There's a certain amount of saltwater fish that came into San Vincenzo from their properties that are closer to the coast. So that's quite interesting to think about the degree to which preserved food is coming into certain sites. So there's one place where we actually have a good picture of fairly observant people following the rule of Benedict and eating the way they ought to have been.
Thank you. I just wondered, and again, I'm a different period. I'm interested in bees. Is there any evidence about honey, beeswax, pollination, that sort of thing?
Gosh, I wish there were. I really wish there were. There's an amazing study that's happening now. Alex Sapoznik's got a project based out of King's College London in which she's looking at commodities of the later Middle Ages, and honey and wax are part of that. And so she's looking at the movement of honey and wax and the cultivation of bees for honey and wax between Iberia and North Africa and other Mediterranean markets using documents that come from Southern Iberia principally. And I don't know of anything that we can point to for early medieval Italy that would allow us to see that kind of thing. I mean, occasionally it appears as an ingredient in recipes for medical recipes, principally. Occasionally it appears in terms of payment of rent in kind, but nothing that would permit me, at my state of knowledge, to reconstruct that industry, as it were. Chris is about to tell me about honey and bees.
No, I'm not.
Okay. You're going to keep that to yourself.
Overall, you've got a picture of Rome has a lot more stuff than other places do. But across time, is the difference between Rome and other cities in Italy, is it something that becomes less? I mean, I'm quite struck by the absence of evidence for imports by the time you get to the 9th century. And when imports pick up again in the 10th and 11th in places like Pisa, they don't pick up in Rome. Yeah. And I wondered what you thought about the overall pattern of imports across that period.
Okay, so one thing I think that's important to think about early medieval Rome is to think about it in proportion. right? So we think about it in terms of what came before, and we also think about it in terms of other places. And Pisa and Milan and even Naples are small in scale, seriously small in scale compared to what's going on in Rome up until, well, the 10th, 11th centuries. You know this perfectly well. So even if it's not that big in terms of population or not that consuming in terms of imported goods, it's still more than anywhere else. And I think that was perceptible to people at the time. I think that the fact that Rome, you go to Rome in order to get this stuff. You go to Rome to get imported textiles. You go to Rome to get stuff. And we know about it from the 7th century. We know about it from the 11th century. I mean, that's people count on the markets of Rome as an important thing. The other thing that I think is important in order to answer your question is, one, how much stuff there is lying around here that allows for reuse, but also how much, and I don't know why I'm telling you this, you know it's better than anyone, how much the sort of efforts of intensification of agricultural production in the countryside around Rome actually provide an economic base for the 11th century that people in Pisa or in Naples are having to start at that point, right? Because they don't have that impulse, that moment that starts in the 9th century with the creation of the Domus Culti and that sort of deliberate concentration of estates to feed Rome that happen in the late 8th and the early 9th centuries. Okay, so come on.
Do we have other questions in the room? Well, we're just opening the, yeah, we've got one there. Can we pass the microphone there?
First of all, thank you for this wonderful talk. I enjoyed it very much. Regarding glass recycling in mosaics, I would just be curious to hear you expand a bit on what you've described as the deliberate creation of an experience for people in Rome, people visiting Rome. Specifically, what you feel to be the register or the subtext of that reuse is the idea that we are stewards of the past, we've triumphed over the past, both, and this is a very open-ended question, but I'm just sort of curious to hear you say more.
So I'd struggle to put anything quite as firm on as that on it, stewards of the past, etc. But perhaps because I'm not a sort of deep intellectual, I mean, I think glass is attractive, right? It's a very attractive substance, and one of the things that I'm struck by is the fact that Rome is filled with pictures of people, tons of pictures of people, images of people, statues of people, right? I don't know if Amanda Claridge was right about that figure, but tons. And those don't go away immediately. They're still here, and they're still visible. And that the medium shifts. So those apse mosaics are not geometric mosaics. They're not they're not blank patterns. They're very often pictures of people, pictures of popes, right? Pictures of popes of the past, pictures of saints, but they're pictures of people. And so I think there's a way in which the medium shifts to create this sort of halls, or the legacy of people of the past shift into glass mosaic. But I also think that I think that it's so hard from where we sit, where we've got the medieval evidence in front of us, and we can't see what those people were looking at. But what those people were looking at were huge hulking buildings with pieces of marble, with glass mosaics on the vaults and on the interiors, with pieces of glass window panes. And they're just sort of shifting it over from one place to the next. They're sort of saying, well, we don't need it in here anymore, but we could really use it over here, where Pope whoever is building a big new important church, which is about a sort of key saint at Rome, which is a quite important local devotional practice and also attracts the tourists who come from elsewhere. So I think that I think that I've never been a big believer in the Carolingian Renovatio or the kind of revival of the past in Rome, because I think it's sort of, this is how we do it in Rome. And that becomes, I think, really quite distinctive. My thoughts on this are also informed by some work that I've been doing recently about papyrus and papal papyri, and the fact that papyrus comes to very, very, very few places outside of Egypt in the early Middle Ages, and the papacy uses it more consistently than anyone else who's making documents in the 9th, 10th, early 11th centuries. And they're making them deliberately showy. Right, huge documents with, outrageously big writing, awkward to read writing, and they're doing it as a presentation of an institutional identity or a kind of collective identity or a Roman papal identity that then they're sending off to Tournu or to wherever. And so they're invested in that. The papacy is playing that game in a bunch of different media, cultivating access to resources that other places don't have.
That's great. Thank you.
That actually leads quite nicely into John's question about the collapse of mosaic production. So this is a question from John Osborne.
Yes. Well,
do you want to
it's a struggle for me to imagine answering this, given what you know so much about in terms of the painting in Rome. But there's clearly a shift. It's not that new images are not being made in the 10th century. Indeed, there's fewer with respect to the 9th century, as you have shown so clearly. But I think that there's also there is a transition in media, and what accounts for it, I'm not sure, because I don't think that people have run out of glass. And it's really not until we get to, well, I won't even say when we start getting sort of production of new glass. In the 11th century, people are still using heavily recycled glass for the vessels that we have here. So I'm not sure. Taste, maybe? I mean, so sort of a weak answer, but I default to your superior knowledge of what the wider panoply of artistic production looks like in the 10th century.
So I think that otherwise online we have some interesting comments that we will share. And we are probably reaching the end of our time, despite a very short interruption for a non-fire. You are still all warmly invited upstairs for a drink and to continue the conversation, but it just remains for me to thank Caroline so much. That was so stimulating and really wonderful.